What if the most disciplined, no-nonsense member of the British royal family finally decided enough was enough? What if the Princess Royal, the woman who has spent a lifetime putting duty above drama, stepped forward with a documentary so explosive it threatens to rewrite everything the public thinks it knows about Meghan Markle? Tonight, we dive into the shattering revelations that sources close to the project claim are about to surface. Secrets carefully guarded for years. Moments the palace never wanted you to see. And a portrait of Meghan that is far darker, far more calculated, and far more shocking than anything that has come before. This is not gossip. This is not another recycled tabloid story. According to those familiar with the production, Princess Anne's involvement has given the project an authority no outsider could ever claim. The documentary, still under tight wraps, is said to draw on private conversations, long-suppressed correspondence, and eyewitness account from within the royal household. And the picture it paints of Meghan is one of ambition without boundaries, manipulation dressed as victimhood, and a pattern of behavior that left even the steeliest members of the family stunned. Princess Anne has never been one for theatrics. While other royals smile for the cameras and manage their public images with careful PR, and simply got on with the job, she is the hardest-working royal of her generation, the one who has quietly carried more engagements than almost anyone else for decades. She does not do interviews for sympathy. She does not do documentaries for attention. So when word began circulating that she had agreed to participate in, and, some claim, heavily influence, a project examining the true impact of Meghan Markle on the monarchy, people inside the institution took notice. This was not revenge. This was reckoning. The documentary, tentatively titled in internal circles something far less sensational than the headlines that will inevitably follow, is said to open with Anne's own measured voice. No raised tones. No tears. Just the calm, precise delivery of a woman who has watched the institution she was born to serve come under sustained attack from within. She is not interested in personal grudges. She is interested in the damage done to the crown, to the staff who serve it, and to the younger members of the family who were left to clean up the emotional wreckage. One of the earliest revelations of film is expected to explore concerns a period immediately after the engagement announcement. Publicly, it was presented as a modern fairy tale, the American actress sweeping into the ancient institution and bringing fresh energy. Privately, according to accounts the documentary will feature, the reality was far more complicated. Multiple sources who worked closely with the household during that time describe a rapid shift in atmosphere. Long-standing protocols were challenged not with thoughtful questions but with demands framed as progressive necessities. Staff who had served the family for years found themselves walking on eggshells. Requests that once would have been handled with quiet efficiency suddenly required layers of justification. Princess Anne, the film suggests, observed this with growing concern. She had seen ambitious outsiders before. She had watched the institution absorb change when change was genuine and necessary. What troubled her, according to those familiar with her thinking, was the speed and the method. The documentary is said to include testimony that had privately warned senior figures that the new arrivals' approach risked alienating the very people who make the monarchy function day to day. The private secretaries, the dressers, the protection officers, the household staff whose loyalty is hard-won and easily lost. Then comes the more personal material. The documentary allegedly examines a relationship between Meghan and other senior women in the family with a level of detail previously unseen. Princess Anne has never been close to the Sussexes in the public eye, and the film does not pretend otherwise. What it does, sources claim, is place on record the private assessments informed after limited but telling interactions. One sequence is said to focus on a particular family gathering in which Meghan's behavior left several members, including an exchanging quiet glances. The details remain under embargo, but the implication is clear. The charm offensive that worked so effectively on cameras did not always translate behind closed doors. Perhaps the most explosive thread the documentary is expected to pull concerns of treatment of staff. Over the years, multiple reports have surfaced of a toxic atmosphere within the Sussex household. Some were dismissed as disgruntled former employees. Others were never fully investigated in public. The new project, bolstered by Anne's institutional knowledge and the access she is said to have facilitated, allegedly brings together a more complete picture. Former aides who previously stayed silent are understood to have spoken on condition of careful framing. Their accounts, if accurate, describe a pattern of sudden shifts in favor, of impossible standards applied unevenly, and of a culture in which loyalty was demanded but rarely returned. Princess Anne's perspective on this is particularly pointed. She has always treated the people who work for the family with a no-nonsense respect. She expects excellence and gives clear direction in return. The documentary is said to contrast that approach with what staff experience under the Sussexes. One former household member, speaking through the film, reportedly describes the emotional toll of never knowing which version of Meghan would appear on any given day, the warm, engaging public figure or the colder, more demanding private one. And quiet fury at the human causes, according to those who have seen early cuts, one of the film's most powerful through lines. The documentary does not stop at the early years. It moves into the period of the departure from royal duties and the subsequent public campaign. Here the tone grows even more forensic. Princess Anne, the film suggests, viewed the Oprah interview not merely as a personal airing of grievances but as a deliberate strike against the institution. The claims of racism, of lack of support, of a family that failed to protect. These landed with particular force because they came from inside. Anne's response, according to the project, was not public outrage. It was private documentation. The film is expected to reveal that certain senior members of the family began keeping more careful records after that point, not out of paranoia but out of a grim recognition that narrative control had become a battlefield. One of the most talked about segments among those with knowledge of the production concerns the alleged attempts to rewrite history after the fact. The documentary is said to examine specific instances in which public statements by the Sussexes appeared to contradict private correspondence or contemporaneous accounts held within the palace. Princess Anne's role here is described as that of a reluctant archivist of truth. She did not seek the material. She did not leak it. But when the project's researchers came asking whether the official record matched the public story, she is understood to have made clear that the institution possessed its own carefully preserved version of events. There is also the question of the younger generation. Prince William and Catherine have largely stayed above the fray in public, but the documentary allegedly explores the private impact of the Sussex drama on the Wales family. Princess Anne, as a senior figure who has watched the next generation navigate extraordinary pressure, is said to have strong views on the emotional burden placed on William and Catherine by the constant need to manage fallout. The film does not claim and speaks for them. What it does claim is that her observations of the strain on their time, their privacy, and their ability to focus on their own work form part of a broader institutional critique. Meghan's own narrative of isolation and lack of support is placed under particular scrutiny. The documentary is expected to present a different timeline of offers of help, of attempts at reconciliation, and of moments when bridges might still have been built. Princess Anne's assessment, according to sources, is that many of those opportunities were rejected not because they were insufficient, but because they did not serve a larger strategy of public positioning. Whether that interpretation holds will be for viewers to decide. What the film appears determined to do is ensure the counter-evidence is no longer locked inside palace walls. As the documentary moves toward its later chapters, the tone grows more urgent. The question it poses is not simply what Meghan did, but what the institution allowed. Princess Anne's participation is framed as an act of institutional self-examination as much as personal testimony. She has lived through previous crises, divorces, scandals, public hostility, and the monarchy survived because it adapted without losing its core. The Sussex chapter, in her reported view, tested that resilience in a new way, through the weaponization of modern media, the blurring of private grievance and public accusation, and the calculated use of victimhood as both shield and sword. One sequence still being refined, according to those close to the edit, focuses on the long-term consequences for royal staff morale and recruitment. Young people who once saw service to the crown as a prestigious and meaningful career began to think twice after the stories that emerged from the Sussex years. Princess Anne, who has always valued continuity and quiet competence, is said to regard this erosion of institutional memory as one of the most damaging legacies. The documentary does not blame Meghan alone. It examines the systems that failed to contain the damage earlier, the advisors who misread the threat, and the senior figures who hoped the problem would simply fade. Yet the film's most unsettling claim may be the simplest. Behind the carefully curated image of progressive duchess fighting an outdated system, the documentary suggests, lay a more ordinary and more ruthless ambition. The desire to extract maximum personal advantage from an ancient institution while simultaneously undermining the very structures that gave that advantage meaning. Princess Anne's contribution is to refuse the romantic framing. She does not deal in fairy tales. She deals in duty, in consequence, and in the hard arithmetic of what happens when individuals place themselves above the institution they claim to save. The project is still being finalized. Release dates remain fluid. Legal reviews are exhaustive, but the people who have seen the current cut describe a work of unusual gravity, less a hit piece than a cold, chloride institutional autopsy. And at its center is the voice of a woman who has never needed the spotlight, speaking now because the alternative is to allow distorted history to harden into accepted fact. This is only the beginning of what the documentary is expected to reveal. The staff accounts grow more detailed, the private assessments become more pointed, and the gap between the public narrative and the internal record widens into a chasm. And that chasm is where the documentary spends its most relentless hours. The staff accounts, once fragmentary and easily dismissed, are woven together with a precision that leaves little room for the old denials. One former senior aide, speaking for the first time under the film's carefully negotiated protections, describes a pattern that began almost immediately after the wedding. Requests that should have been routine, travel arrangements, diary coordination, even the simplest household logistics, became battlegrounds. The language used was never openly confrontational at first. It was framed as modernizing, as protecting mental health, as setting boundaries. Yet the practical effect, the A claims, was a steady erosion of any system that did not place Meghan's preferences at the absolute center. Princess Anne recorded reflections on this period are said to be among the film's most cutting. She does not raise her voice. She simply notes that an institution the size and age of the monarchy cannot function if every decision is filtered through one person's emotional weather. The documentary places her observation against contemporaneous notes kept by household managers. Those notes, according to sources who have seen the relevant sequences, record sudden changes of plan, last-minute cancellations that left staff scrambling, and a growing sense that loyalty was being tested rather than valued. One entry, read aloud in the film in a deliberately flat tone, describes a senior member of the household leaving a meeting in tears after being told their decades of service were part of the problem. The private assessments grow sharper still when the documentary turns to the question of narrative control. Here the film allegedly introduces material that has never circulated publicly, internal discussions about how certain stories reach the press, and the timing of those stories relative to key royal events. Princess Anne is portrayed not as a conspiracy theorist, but as a woman who noticed patterns. When positive coverage of the Sussexes coincided with negative briefings about other members of the family, she is said to have asked, quietly, whether coincidence was still a credible explanation. The documentary does not claim she has definitive proof of orchestration. What it does claim is that the volume and precision of the leaks eventually forced even the most cautious courtiers to treat the possibility as operational reality. One sequence focuses on the period surrounding the birth of the Sussexes' first child. Publicly, the story was one of joyful modernity colliding with stuffy tradition. Privately, the film suggests the atmosphere inside the relevant households was far more strained. Staff who had prepared for the arrival in the usual discreet manner found themselves navigating sudden shifts in protocol that appeared designed less for the baby's welfare than for photographic advantage. Princess Anne's reported reaction was characteristically blunt. A child is not a prop. The documentary places that sentiment against later public claims that the family had failed to offer adequate support. The gap between the two versions is left for the audience to measure. As the film moves into the years after the departure from royal duties, the tone becomes almost clinical. The Oprah interview is dissected not as a single television event, but as a culmination of a longer strategy. Princess Anne's contribution here is described as forensic. She is said to have reviewed the claims line by line against the institutional record, records of offers made, of meetings proposed, of security discussions held. The documentary does not assert that every claim was false. It does assert that the overall portrait of a family that turned its back was incomplete to the point of distortion. Anne's understated conclusion, according to those familiar with the cut, is that selective truth can be more damaging than outright invention because it is harder to refute without appearing defensive. The impact on the wider family receives sustained attention. William and Catherine are not interviewed, nor does the film claim to speak for them. What it does is present Princess Anne's observations of the secondary damage. The hours spent managing fallout instead of focusing on their own work. The private conversations in which younger members of the household expressed bewilderment at the scale of the hostility directed at them through the media. One particularly quiet passage in the documentary is said to recount in private remark that the monarchy had survived wars, divorces, and public scandals, but had rarely faced an adversary who understood the modern information environment so thoroughly from the inside.